Hello, my name is Roisin and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to talk to you about 10 of my favourite books by authors from Africa. Specific particular reason why I'm doing this video at this moment, I don't think that it falls in line with anything, but if you've been watching my channel for a few years now, you will know I have done some videos where I've read from various different parts of the world. I'll leave a playlist linked in the cards above if you're interested in seeing those, and a few of them being regions in Africa. So I have done one reading books from Southern Africa and reading books from Central Africa. I also have read a fair amount of fiction from Nigeria, as I think that Nigerian fiction is one of the, outside of the UK-US context, one of the places where more books get get published in the UK, probably partly because they are written in English a lot of the time, and also probably because of the large Nigerian diaspora in this country. So I've ended up reading quite a few books from Nigerian authors. Obviously, African fiction is a very broad term. There are 54 countries in Africa, and there are so there's a wide range of different countries, and not all of them are as represented in what is published. I think that probably the Anglophone countries are the most represented. I mean, out of the countries on my list, we certainly have Nigeria, as I said, and also Zambia, Zimbabwe, South Africa, so a fair amount of Anglophone countries, which means that the books didn't have to be translated first. But I have noticed that quite regularly some of the books from African countries that I read end up on my top books of the year list, and it's definitely an area I want to read more from. I think that whilst obviously there is going to be a broad range of fiction from Africa, I think that a lot of the topics that I have read from have been similar, perhaps because what gets published in the UK again has specific themes that resonate in the UK publishing industry. So I would like to read more broadly, but in similar way to South American fiction, I do think that a lot of this sub-Saharan African fiction is kind of in conversation with one another, has a similar canon perhaps, in the way that, you know, a lot of like British, American, Australian and Kiwi books have the same canon as well. So anyway, that was a long introduction, but I have 10 excellent books to talk to you about from sub-Saharan Africa. I don't have any North African books in here. I don't think I've ever read a book from a North African author, so if you would like to recommend me some North African fiction, do leave that in the comments down below, as well as any other African fiction that I don't mention, obviously. So the first one on my list is probably, well, there are two on here that are my favourites, I would say, of all of them, and then the rest kind of are all excellent. But the first one is The Old Drift by Namwalli Serpell, and Namwalli Serpell is a Zambian author. And this is a kind of sweeping epic, as all the blurbs say, set in Zambia from 1904 up until 2024, but it was published in 2018. So in the beginning it is written as this colonialist notebook. And there is an incident that happens that involves 3 men in Zambia in 1904. There is this British explorer guy, this Italian guy who runs a shop, and this native Zambian man. And an incident happens, and then they all split off, go their separate ways. And we follow the trails of their families as they end up back in Zambia over the course of 3 generations. So the sections is split into the grandmothers, the mothers, and the children. And it explores the history of Zambia through these 3 different families over the course of 120 years and into the future. And we also have a Greek chorus of mosquitoes, and malaria is a big part of this, and the development of medical technologies as well. So it's a really broad-ranging book that goes into the UK and to Italy, but eventually back to Zambia, and explores colonialism and also neo-colonialism, experimentation on Zambian people by medical practitioners, and the fight for independence and the corruption of the government after that. It's a really comedic book, and one that focuses in very much on characters and them talking to one another about global situations, or about national situations, rather than really being one with a lot of plots. It's kind of like the plot happens off page, but we really get close into these characters who are all really interesting people, and it's very, very funny. I've said before that if you like Zadie Smith, then I think you would like this, because it has a similar kind of large group of characters that makes kind of a political and social point without it being too didactic or on the nose. It's very well done and has a kind of wry side eye. And as I said, it goes into the future and gets a bit like Afrofuturism, technology based stuff, kind of seeps in at the end there, but it's not to any extreme degree. That's not really my kind of style or my genre. Generally speaking, I'm not really a science fiction person, so if you are not as well, I think you would still get on board with this, even though it does go in that direction towards the end. I think that it's done in a more like understated way that really goes in with the rest of the book, and since the rest of the book is kind of an alternate history of Zambia, I think that it fits and it doesn't overbear the rest of the story. But yeah, it's a really wonderfully written book, and as I said, very funny. It's a kind of bizarre, surreal and just never explained, which is exactly what I like in books. If you are a character focused reader, I think you would like it. If you're a plot focused reader, there's enough happening to keep you going. If you're an ideas focused reader, a lot of ideas, and if you like humour. So yeah, I think it's an excellent book, really one of the best books that I've read ever, probably one of my favourite books of all time now, so I would definitely recommend that. In the vlog where I read that one, I also read House of Stone by Nuvuyo, Rosa, Tshuma, and I really fell in love with that one. It is a debut, and it is one of those books that you're just like astounded that it is a debut, because it is so tight. Like there is nothing superfluous about it, nothing missing or nothing that feels a bit clunky, nothing overly done. Everything is so streamlined and so well done, and I really enjoyed it. This is set in Zimbabwe. Nuvuyo Rosa Tshuma is a Zimbabwean author, and this is set, I think it's 2007 or 2014, when there is a political protests and a boy goes missing during these protests, and he was with the lodger of this family who knows what's happened, but he hasn't told the mother and father. Tries to get himself closer to the mother and father and kind of tries to wheedle his way into their life, and in doing so he hears their stories of the Zimbabwean fight for independence and the rise of Robert Mugabe, and it is really a harrowing read, like really dark, and really everything that you would expect to happen in a book about war happens, including to genocide, like as far as genocide. So there is a very dark things that happen in this book, and it talks about colonialism and Rhodesia, which was one of the worst colonial states in terms of the excesses of it, but also the Robert Mugabe, the rise of Robert Mugabe and the darkness that happened there. It talks about culpability and who can be a victim, the darkness that even victims will inflict, and the way the things that happen to your psyche in a situation like that, the way that it can change people. And our main character is an unreliable narrator who is really twisted and really like, you can't really like any of the characters in this book, really. It is not that kind of a book, but everyone is so well explored, and it is, I think, not gratuitous or superfluous in terms of the darkness or the violence that is shown on the page, and on a sentence by sentence level is one of the most beautiful books that I've ever read. It really reads so wonderfully, and it's amazing, this lushness contrasted with this darkness. I think it works really well. This one has no humour. It is not a funny book, but it is a book that has elements of hope and of lightness and of humanity. The plot is wrapping in on itself in a way that makes you feel like constricted. It's a really brilliant book. I really enjoyed it, and one that I think I would like to read again, which is always, I think, high praise for it. Then last year's Booker Prize winner was won by a South African author, Damon Galgut, for his book The Promise, and I read all of the Booker Prize books last year. Again, there will be a video in the cards if you would like to check that out, and it was my favourite. I absolutely adored this book. This is about a family of white South Afrikaners outside Pretoria on a farm. And it begins during apartheid, when the mother of this family dies, and she asks her husband to leave the house in which their black servant lives to that woman, to give her her house. Only at the time, it is because it is apartheid, she actually wouldn't be legally allowed to own it, but the father refuses. Well, he doesn't refuse her dying wish, but he never does anything about it anyway. And this family, they have 3 children, and the book goes through 4 different time periods in their life where significant events happen inside the family and also in South Africa more generally. So we jump forward through the decades during this time. So one of the time periods is the release of Nelson Mandela, one of them is the arrest of South African president for corruption. So there's a lot of different things that happen. Jacob Zuma, is that right? Wittily and wonderfully written. Again, a lot of darkness and very, very dark humour throughout this book, but I thought so wonderfully done. It is written from this very, very strange perspective, which I think not everybody likes, but I absolutely did, where sometimes it is in the third person of an omniscient narrator, and then sometimes it is in the first person from the perspective of one of these children characters. It slides through these perspectives without any warning. It's not like one chapter is in third person and then the next chapter is in first person. It just slides between the two instantly without any breaks. Sometimes in the same sentence it goes from being first to third or third to first person, and sometimes in those slippages it is in second person, talking to you directly. And I saw Damon Galgut talk about how he is talking to white South Africa with these books, but white settler colonialists in general, and it is just brilliantly witty. It feels kind of jarring, and it makes you aware of what he's doing, but not in a way that feels clumsy. It feels very intentional and bringing awareness to the construction. It's very well done. I think all of the characters, again, odious characters. We only have from the perspective of white characters up until near the very, very end. It gets its points across really well, again, I feel, without being too didactic, and it's just a brilliantly written book. I feel like I'm talking about these books for ages, so I should move on. Okay, next we have a book that is more that is less experimental, I think more accessible than some of these other books, and that is The Girl with the Louding Voice by Abi Dure. And this is, Abi Dure is a Nigerian author. This is about a young girl who is sold at the very beginning of the book. Her mother has died, and her mother always wanted her to get an education, but because her father is in debt, he sells her for a bride price to an old man, and she moves to live with this old man as his third wife in this very abusive relationship. She's a child, and it is, yeah, horrible. And then a tragedy happens and she runs away, and it changes her life. This is about class in Nigeria. It is a book that really explores different class levels and the extreme inequality in a Nigerian society, and the treatment of women as well throughout Nigerian society, through this patriarchal society. It explores the way that even class cannot get you out of the violent misogyny, but it at the same time explores how class-based violence is inflicted even more strongly. Our main character is one of the most endearing, brilliant characters that I've read. I really connected with her, and I felt that she was had such resilience and such brightness and spark, and I really enjoyed that. I think it's a book that if you've read a lot of YA or more commercial fiction, it kind of strides that line, because it is this coming of age story about this girl who is dealing with some of the worst things you can deal with, but at the same time there are moments of hope. And yeah, it's very much about gender and education, access to education, and also expectations of women. So we see various different women in here. We've got the house girls, which is what our main character becomes, the women who are their bosses, but the way that it's kind of a form of modern day slavery because of wage theft. Also other women who are friends with this older woman. There's one in particular, and her not being pregnant, and the way that so motherhood is another very strong theme through this book. But yeah, it's again another dark book, but I think there's a lot of hope. I do feel like most of the books that I am talking about here are quite dark and deal with very serious themes, and in part that's because I like those sorts of books. Most of the books that, if you look at my favourite books of all time, cover themes like that. It is the thing that I find most interesting, but I would like to read more joyous books as well from African writers, from writers from around the world, because I do feel like a lot of what gets translated or published, in this case published, is that darker fiction. Another coming-of-age story is Nervous Conditions by Tsitsi Dangerembga, who is another Zimbabwean author. This is the first in a trilogy, although I haven't read the rest of the trilogy yet, so I know I need to, as This Mournable Body, which was the third one, was shortlisted for the Booker Prize last year? No, the year before last, in 2020. And I but I did really enjoy this. I really enjoy a coming of age novel, and I think that this one is done really well. The writing is quite sparse and not very descriptive, not very flowery. We are told from the perspective of our main character, another young girl in a Zimbabwean family who wants to go to school again, but she is not allowed to because her brother has to go to school. But when he dies, she gets the opportunity, and that kind of her distance from herself and her distance from her family is very clear. She's very much a watcher in this family, and not a lot happens. She ends up going to school, she ends up living with her uncle, and we see, this is Zimbabwe pre-independence, but we see her living in this village with her family, and then her uncle, who is much wealthier than them, her going to live with him, and her getting an education that way. It's a book, like I said, where not a lot happens. There are lots of sort of separate themes kind of stitched together, and I think that's because it is kind of auto-fiction based on Tsitsi Dangerembga's own experience growing up. It's much more explores a culture, and this one girl's movement through that, and the way that the culture affects her and other people, particularly her cousin whom she lives with. What I really loved about this novel was the sense of place in it. It felt really fully realised, as it's not a place or a time period that I have ever experienced myself. It was so well done, the way that it really came to life for me, the way that I could really see and feel grounded in Zimbabwe in the 1960s, I think it is. I felt like all of the characters came quite well realised as well, and I thought it was very sort of a rich world to explore, because there's not a lot of plot and not a lot happens. Just this girl growing up needs that to be a compelling read, but I think it did a very good job of that. Next, a classic of Nigerian fiction, one that I think probably most people will have heard of, is Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe, but it is so well written that I thought I couldn't leave it out. This is a piece of historical fiction, so it's a classic, but it's a 1960s classic, but it's set in the 18th century, and it is about one man who is kind of important man in his tribe in interior Nigeria, I think. Because of his own pride, his fatal flaw of hubris, he brings himself down. He commits these serious acts of violence that leads to him being shunned from his tribe, and then when he comes back after 7 years of shunning, this tribe has met with English people who are trying to colonise the country, and he sees the insidious ways that they are working themselves into this place before the violence begins. It is another book written with such starkness. I read the introduction, which was written by Achebe as well, and he talked about how he didn't want to judge anyone in the situation, not the people pre-contact with Europeans and not Europeans either. He wanted to lay it out very simply and starkly and matter-of-factly, and that's very much what you get from the writing, but the characters themselves are so alive and vibrant that you can understand where they're coming from, and I think that's what Achebe does so well, is make everyone comprehensible without making anyone sympathetic, and I think that is really well done in this novel. It's again a lot of darkness, and even before the colonialism, is Igbo culture that he is talking about. He's kind of, it does feel a bit like it's being explained for an outsider, Igbo culture, but I think it's done in such a matter-of-fact way that it feels well done, and I mean, I am an outsider, so that makes sense. I think it's such a short little book, but it manages to pack in so much, and it has quite a impact on you, as it's a very impactful read. Our main character, you cannot really, I found it very impossible to empathise with him because of the violence and the misogyny inherent in his culture and in his actions, but nevertheless it was a very compelling read, and one that has so much richness to it. Like, it's deceptively simple in terms of the style of writing, but there is so much more you can get from it if you read it. Next, a piece of Angolan fiction, and that is A General Theory of Oblivion by Jose Eduardo Agualusa. This is a very strange little book, another one with a magic realist touch to it, that I really enjoyed. It's very short, but really wonderful. It's based on a true story, which seems really bizarre because it's about a woman who, during the Angolan fight for independence from the Portuguese, bricks herself into her flat and lives there for like 40 years and doesn't know what's going on outside. She just survives. So this woman has left Portugal because of a really violent rape that happened to her in Portugal, and she moves to Angola, where her sister is living with her husband. And then the fight for independence breaks out, and her sister and her husband flee back to Portugal with a load of diamonds. But she doesn't want to leave, so she bricks herself into this flat and doesn't know anything that's going on outside, doesn't know what's happened with the fight for independence, doesn't know who's in charge, knows absolutely nothing about what's going on outside. But because of these diamonds, because people want to find these diamonds, there is all this stuff that happens just outside the bricked up wall. And we see that as well as what she's going through, and eventually a young boy climbs into her flat and she kind of starts to see the outside world after that point. But yeah, it's a bizarre book about the absolute surreality of a country that is completely in the midst of revolution in this way, a kind of complete overthrowal of a system, and the way that it's very much like we're inside organised crime and kind of militias. There's a lot of like weird stuff that happens, and it's another book with a lot of dark humour in it. There's a singing pygmy hippopotamus at one point, which shows you how bizarre this book actually is. But I really loved it. I thought it was wonderfully written. I thought it was quite funny, and I really, and so compelling if you like a kind of crime mob boss kind of situation alongside this weird magical realism and characters who never seem to be doing anything sensible. Like, nothing makes sense that they're doing. It's a very bizarre book, but I think it's about how surreal that kind of situation feels, and in that way it works really well, because I was very confused but I enjoyed myself the entire time, which is a theme of books that I like. Next, a book from the Republic of the Congo, and that is The Death of Comrade President by Alain Mabanckou. Now, I know Alain Mabanckou is quite a prolific author, I think, probably the most famous living author from the Republic of the Congo, and this is about this is based on his own experience. Again, it's another kind of auto-fiction set over the course of 3 days about a young boy during time when the Comrade President is assassinated, and this little boy doesn't know how he is related to this assassination. So we have our first day is just him going to school and going to the market, what it is like to live in the Republic of the Congo in the 1970s under a communist, pseudo-communist regime, and the things that he learns at school, and him going to the market and the skinny dogs. There's a lot about dogs. He really wants a dog. And then we have when this assassination happens, but the way it's told to us, because it's told from the perspective of this little boy, he has no idea what's going on, and he's really confused. And then these 3 men arrive, and they talk about what happened in the presidential palace and how the assassination went down, and we discover how this young boy and his family are related to what happened to the president. And it's a very slow moving book. Like I said, it's just over the course of 3 days, where a large chunk of it is just conversations happening and the perspective that we're being told from this little boy not understanding what's going on. We only see and know and understand what he can know and understand, and so he tells the same jokes over and over. It's a very childish book with a lot of repetition. But we can read between the lines to see a lot more of what's going on, and the ending really is one of those endings that really makes such an impact. It's unexpected, but not in a way that doesn't make sense. And yeah, I really enjoyed it for exploring this very specific place and a very specific time in this place. It kind of, if you liked Free by Leah Upi, which is a memoir, but it is similar in that Albania was a closed communist state, and there are similarities with the Republic of the Congo in the 70s and Albania, I think, because of that kind of closedness and his going to school and all of the things he learns. It's a really sad book as well, in ways that the boy doesn't quite understand. So yeah, really interesting. I do enjoy books often told from the perspective of children, because I think when they're done well, they have that impact of not over-explaining anything to you, and I think that this one is one of those that is done. Next is one by a Nigerian-British author, and this is What Is Not Yours by Helen Oyeyemi, who grew up in the UK but she was born in Nigeria, and this is a collection of short stories. This one is the only book that's not actually set in the African country from which the person writing is from. This is set in kind of a fairy tale, non-specific. It is an example of a writer from Africa writing a more joyful, I don't know if I would say joyful because there is some darkness here, but it's not about like how bad things can be in Africa. Like it's kind of about fairy tales, but it's one of my favourite short story collections I've ever read. Helen Oyeyemi is such an interesting writer. She really has both humour and beauty in her writing, and I think everything feels really well drawn. I can really see her settings, and I really enjoy her sense of humour. I think it's quite dark, quite sardonic, and I think there's a lot of wit in the stories that she writes, and I think a lot of layers. Like if you read them again, you would get a lot more from them. Like I said, these are fairy tale retellings, although I don't know how many of them are actually fairy tale retellings, but there's definitely a Little Red Riding Hood one, which is really bizarre, and a few that are in this puppet school that's kind of a Pinocchio retelling, and I really enjoyed those ones too. I've yet to read any of Helen Oyeyemi's novels, but I do think I would really enjoy them because of that kind of slightly unorthodox tone to them. There's like wink and nod, like they're very self-aware, and I think I enjoy the way that they are self-aware. Sometimes self-awareness can be jarring, but for me the way Helen Oyeyemi does it is very, very good. I do think that she does an interesting job of taking like fairy tale archetypes and fleshing them out to be full people, and looking at fairy tales from a slightly different perspective than you necessarily get in a traditional fairy tale retelling. And like I said, her writing is just, on a line-by-line basis, her writing is just absolutely stunning. And then the final book on my list is an Ethiopian book, and that is The Shadow King by Maza Mengistu. And this I read really early on in my channel, but I absolutely adored this book. It's set in Ethiopia in the 1930s on the eve of Mussolini's invasion, and it follows the guerrilla warfare that took place as the Ethiopians fought off the Italians. And we have from the perspective of this woman who is kind of enslaved, I think, to this family because of a promise made with her mother. I think that's quite mysterious, and the way that she is treated by this family is really appalling. But then they become warriors, and the women fight as well in this situation. And there is one point, the Emperor of Ethiopia flees to London, and they get a peasant boy who looks like him to pretend to be him to gin up the people, to make them feel more like they can keep fighting. And we are also told from the perspective of this Italian war photographer who has to take photographs of everything that's going on, and he is under the control of one of the most vile generals, and he takes pictures of the violence that this general enacts against the Ethiopian people, which is really disgusting. But because he is Jewish, he is under threat from this general who says who knows that his parents have already been taken, and that he will be sent back home to Mussolini's Italy and potentially to Poland during the Second World War if he does anything to step out of line. And so there's really interesting perspectives there. It is told there's a collective chorus of women who talk through various points of this novel, and there is lots of references to light and sun. The Ethiopians use light to communicate, like light and mirrors to communicate whilst they are doing their guerrilla warfare, but also there are vignettes of photographs that the Italian has taken, and a lot of talk about light and photography as well. It's one really, there's really a lot going on in this book. It's really multi-layered and very, very interesting. Also dark, also violent, very, very much dark and violent, and a difficult read, but I thought absolutely so compelling. Such a strong read. 10 books by African authors that I have loved. These are my favourites that I have read so far, but I am always looking for more books to read, so please do leave them in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this video, would you like me to do more recommendations from other parts of the world? I could do my favourite books from South Asia or Southeast Asia or South America, anywhere in the world. I could talk about some of my favourite books. So if you have any requests, also leave them in the comments down below. I try to read as much from around the world as I can because I find it so much more interesting. Please do remember remember to give this video a thumbs up if you liked it. I will put another couple of videos here for you to check out from me reading from various parts of the world, so you can see my in-depth thoughts at the time. I try to put out new videos twice a week, so do remember to subscribe if you haven't already, and thank you for watching. I will see you again very soon. Bye bye!